Now that we've learned the back stitch, we're moving on to our second stitch. This is called the lazy daisy. Now in our sampler, we're going to use this stitch to create both the leaves on our fern fronds as well as the petals on the actual daisy flower. So I'm going to show you again on the canvas, our giant sized fabric here, how to start the lazy daisy. So we're going to pull the thread through. And I'll show you, you'll want to do a stay stitch here when you're doing it on your actual fabric. And I'll show you that when we move over to there. You'll come up through, and then you're going to go right back down in the exact same hole you just came up from. And you're going to see that your thread, or in this case our yarn, is going to make a loop. Then what you're going to do is bring your needle up at the point that you want, however long you want your petal or leaf to be. So I'm going to make mine about this long. Actually, I'm going to make it shorter because with this yarn, I've only got one strand and it's not going to hold its shape quite as well. So then you're going to pull your yarn through. You don't want to pull super tight. You want to leave it just enough to be as long as your stitch, but enough give so that it's still rounded here at the bottom. And then to hold that loop in place, you're going to come down just on the other side of your yarn or your thread to hold that in place. So now we have our first lazy daisy. Now if we were going to stitch like we were on our fern, you would come to the next place that your leaf starts and you will come up, and again you'll go back down in the exact same spot you came up from. And this is where sometimes I have to use my other hand. It helps to kind of straighten out your thread a little bit to see where you're going. You're going to bring your needle up, however long your stitch is. You're going to pull it through. And again, not so tight that you lose. If you pull it really tight, you see that you lose all the shape of your petal. So if you happen to pull it a little extra tight, it's really easy to just pull some thread back out, loosen it up a little bit, and then tack it back down, going right back in on the other side of your thread. So now that's the lazy daisy. So we're going to move over to our sampler, and I'm going to show you, you will have taken your needle, we've finished our sewing machine, and you're going to add or thread 3 strands of the dark green onto your needle. Then you're going to go to your frond that you're going to work on, and you're going to back stitch up the stem. So it's the exact same stitch back and forth. You can use a little bit longer one. And now we're ready to add our lazy daisy leaves to it. So I'm going to bring my needle up right here at the base of my leaf. I'm going to bring it right back down in the same spot. And then I'm going to bring my needle up before I've pulled it too far, up at the top of my leaf shape. And then I'm going to pull, and sometimes I find it's easier to keep the shape of your leaf if you pull the thread kind of against, so that you're running your thread along the edge of your fabric. And that way it just sort of slows it down a little bit and gives you a chance to keep that shape as close as you can. And then you're just going to put your stitch right back in on the other side of your thread and hold it in place. And then you're going to move down to the next one, just at the bottom of your leaf. Pull it up. And you'll notice that I use my thumb a lot of times that's holding my hoop to also hold my thread, to keep it kind of out of the way, to keep my loops open when I'm trying to do a stitch like this. Sometimes it helps to straighten out your thread so you don't get so many knots. All of those different ways, you'll find you're using your non-dominant hand almost as much as the hand you're stitching with. So when I pull it through and I have the shape I want, I'm going to bring it back down on the other side. Now again, just like with the back stitch, you're going to want to practice a little bit getting your tension just right so that the shapes of your leaves are a little bit uniform. You know, as much as our unofficial embroidery is, or our unprofessional, not unprofessional, our hand done embroidery. So you would, again, I would really suggest that you create on your scratch sheet. And I just like to hand form them. They don't need to be perfect. Flowers in real life aren't perfect. And I just run my little loops and practice my daisies so that I have the right tension with the threads that I'm using and make sure that I'm getting the shape that I want before I come over to my sampler. So I'm going to show you this last one, and then I'll show you how to make the daisy flower itself once we've moved on to the next color. So when I am doing a sampler like this, what I like to do is when I can, I will do all of my stitches in one color before I switch on to the next one. So in this case, I'll do the sewing machine all in blue. When I'm finished with that, then I'll move on and do all of the ferns all over the whole thing. And then I'll move on to the next one. So we're gonna pretend that we've gotten all the way done with all of our ferns. And then we're going to switch over to a needle that now has yellow embroidery floss and all 6 strands. And this one, you don't separate them all, you just pull them straight off the skein and load it and put it onto your needle. Now when we're doing these these actual daisies themselves, you can see that each of our petals comes into the exact same spot. Because we have so many stitches coming into the one same spot, it's a real pain if you have a knot right there. Trying to avoid it is annoying. So this is a perfect example of a time to use a stay stitch. So I'm going to show you again really quick how to do that stay stitch so that you don't have a knot right in the center of this daisy you're trying to make. So what you're going to do is bring up your needle along one of these lines that your petal's going to be, and it will end up being covered by the actual petal that you're making. So you're going to come up. I like to turn over my hoop to make sure, got extra green threads floating around here, to make sure that I'm not losing my thread till I leave about a ½ inch or so. I'm going to pinch it in place, hold it with my finger, turn it back over. I'm going to bring my needle down just a couple of threads away from where I came up and pull it down to make one tight, tiny little stitch. And now I'm ready to start my actual daisy stitch. So I'm going to come into the center where all of these petals meet. I'm going to bring it around, pull it all the way out. Then I'm going to put it back into that same hole, pull it out. And then before I pull too much thread out, I'm going to bring my needle back up right at the top of my petal. I'm going to pull it so that I have my nice round shape. And then I'm going to bring it back in at the top. And now when I go to put in my second petal, I'm going to go right back to that same center spot as close as I can make it. And you know, you're going to be close to, maybe not exactly, and it's all good. If you take one thing away from this whole thing, it's that handmade is beautifully imperfect, and that's my favorite part about it. You go right back down to the same spot it comes up. Bring your needle in at the top of your petal. And I like, when I'm making these daisies, I kind of like to alternate just so that it adds a little bit of depth to my petals and the way that they land on the flower. So I kind of go every other, pull it, hold it at the top. And we're just going to finish this one off real quick because there's only a few. Up through the center. Back down through the same hole. And you can see not every stitch that I do is perfect, even when I'm just sitting at home relaxing, doing this. Everything ends up unique and different, and that's a-okay. You're going to pull it back through. Whoops. And that one I got a little carried away, tacking it down. Again, up through the center. Like I said, I'm kind of skipping all over this flower, and it just adds. The other thing I'm thinking what happened with this stitch right here, you can see it's a little bit wonky, is when you're doing your petal, if your thread gets twisted around and it's not laying flat, then your petal can get twisted at the top a little bit like that. So make sure that you've got it in the actual loop. So you have this gigantic version of the petal that you're going to make. And then once you pull it through, I'm going to put it at the top right there. Then your gigantic version is going to shrink and shrink. Sorry, I've This is all tangled up with my green thread going on under there, which I am just going to snip and get it out of my way. This is why you finish one color all the way before you move on to the next one. Don't leave big long strands like I did. Okay, so I'm going to turn this back around the way it was. So you have your giant petal here, and now it's going to shrink and shrink and shrink until it's the right size petal. Now this is bringing up another interesting point. Now I did not trim off the extra little threads that I left when I did my stay stitch. And because I did that, when I went to pull this stitch up, I carried some of those thin strands through with me. So once you have a stitch or two down, I would go back and trim off the other ones. If you forget and don't get around to it and you end up with a stray thread like this, just pull it out, and I just grab my scissors and trim it off close, and you're not gonna see it, and it's gonna be just fine. So I'm gonna do this one last petal, and then we can finish off this daisy. And these ones, there is plenty of space to do another stay stitch and a flat stitch, or it's just as easy to do a knot in the back of this one. Once you've finished off your flower, you don't have to worry about running into that knot over and over again, and so it's just fine to tie it off with a knot on the back. Like we said, if you're wanting to finish it flat, you would just go through a couple of threads, go back the opposite way through a couple of other threads, and your thread is anchored. Or you can loop it through, run your needle through that loop, and tie a knot. Either way, when you're finished, you just clip your thread, and then you move on to your next daisy. Now, a lot of times when you have a project like this and you're doing multiple flowers, if you have your felt backing behind it, you could go from one daisy to the next daisy to the next daisy and just carry your thread, run it across, and not tie it off after every single one. If you're not using the felt, I would make sure after every flower that you tie it off and then move on to the next one, so that you're not carrying those threads, because they will be visible behind this really light background fabric. So get all of your flowers done, and then we'll move on to our next stitch.